Good afternoon. I'm Clivia Torres, and I'm the social worker. And today I'm the Herzegovina, and today I will be talking about understanding the Hispanic and Latino cultures. Next slide, please. This presentation is supported by the Health Resources and Service Administrations of the United States Department of Health and Human Services as part of an award totaling $3,750,000 with 0% finance with non-governmental sources. The context of those of the author are of myself and do not necessarily represent the official views or the endorsement by HRSA, HHS, or the United States government. Next slide, please. In terms of conflict of interest, I do not have any conflict of interest to declare. And when we're talking with aging adults, older adults, it's very important for us to always remember that it should be an age-friendly approach. It should be the 4 M's, which is like what matters to the patient. It's also very important to review the medication that the patient is on. And it's very important to do that on a regular basis. It's also important to understand the patient's mentation, like what they identify is going on. Do they have depression, dementia, or delirium, anything like that? And in terms of mobility, how do they get around? Are they able to walk with assistance or without assistance? Thank you. Next slide. So today I am going to do an overview of what the Hispanic and Latino cultures are. I also would like to talk about approaches when you're interacting with both cultures. And I also would like to define what are the best practices for the Hispanic and Latino cultures. Next slide, please. So as a brainstorm, I just wanted to ask, who are the Hispanics and Latinos? What makes up the Hispanic and Latino cultures? So Victoria, next slide. This is just an image that I found representative.
Did you want to give people a chance to respond?
Oh, if they want to respond, they can add and they can put it in the chat if they want.
Only making note because I find that this is an area of misconception.
Well, since no one has responded, I'm going to move on to the next slide because I have a video that would basically define what makes up Latinos. Or from Tanya's, Hispanics have been broadly defined as individuals who come from Central and South America. Absolutely true. So, but you can move to the next slide. Latinos is the general term supplied. Okay, thank you, Tanya. So Victoria, you can move on to the next slide and you can put on the video. The video is before this one.
Let me know if you hear the sound.
I do not hear the sound.
You know how to do this when you, oh, sorry, go Victoria.
So stop share and I have to reshare the sound.
Yeah, when you bring up the share screen, there should be a little checkbox in the bottom of that window for sharing computer sound. Got it?
Yeah.
In Spanish is. Ask you, do you know what the difference between Latina or Hispanic and Spanish is?
Between Latina, Hispanic, and Spanish. I'm
gonna have to say where they live.
Okay, so like geographic.
Geographic.
I mean, they're just different ethnicities. I mean, between Mexican to Latin America to European.
That was confusing. The general public and the media use both of these terms interchangeably, but there is a slight difference. Hispanic is a term that refers to Spanish-speaking origin or ancestry. Latino is a more frequently used term which refers to origin or ancestry to Latin America.
Does Latina mean someone who speaks Spanish? Because in the case of Brazil, you speak Portuguese.
is basically based on whether you or your family speak the language of Spanish, whereas Latino is focusing more on geographic location, that being Latin America. So unlike Hispanic, Latino includes Brazilians but excludes Spaniards.
I hate when people call me Spanish because I'm not.
Okay.
You're Spanish because you're from Spain.
Spanish is from Spain, like
Yes!
conquistador, type thing. Europe. I know a lot of people when they enter somewhere and they hear someone speak Spanish, like, oh, they're Spanish, and I'm like, no, they spoke Spanish to you. Yeah. That does not mean that they're from Spain.
For starters, Spanish describes someone who comes from Spain. It's a term of nationality, but it's also a language. Think of Italian. It's a language, but it's also a nationality. Which one is Latina? ¿Por qué no es Latina?
Por el semblante de la cara.
Semblante que tiene más African features.
No se ve latina, no se ve hispana. Like, she looks black.
Can you be black and be Latina?
I believe so, but some people of, Latin descent are like, no, we're different.
Those are the ones that have been colonized.
I'm not even gonna disagree with you there.
I think they all could be Latina. I feel like they could all be Hispanic. I mean, they all could be Spanish too. You don't know.
Yes! Perfect! You can't really tell just by a person's face whether they're Latino, Hispanic, or Spanish. Because many Latin American countries, like those of my parents, Colombia and Peru, were colonized by Spain, many folks don't feel the need or want to identify with a term that indicates them belonging to Spain. Maybe think of it this way. Hispanic, a sense of community through a connection to Spain. Latino, a sense of community through a history of colonization from Spain. Colonization isn't something that we just read about in our textbooks. We feel the effects of centuries of colonization today through lost history, erasure of native and African languages, faith practices, basically our culture. So it's no wonder why so many folks just don't want to identify with the term Hispanic. That doesn't mean that Latino doesn't have any remnants of Spanish colonialism. I mean, Latino and Latina is supposed to describe folks from Latin America, but the term Latin America only came to be after European Spanish imperialism. It's important to remember that none of these forms of identity are perfect. And that's because they're socially constructed and mostly only used in the US. They also lead people to assume that Latino or Hispanic is a race, when that's not true. Which is why so many Latinos with African ancestry have begun to use the term Afro-Latina. As for me, well, until a term that comes around that fully encompasses and embraces both the indigenous and African influences of Latin America, I'm gonna stick to identifying as an indigenous Latina. How do you identify? How do you feel about the terms Latina, Hispanic, and Spanish? Let me know in the comments down below.
Next slide, please, Victoria. So I just basically wanted to provide like an actual image of what Latinos are, the different countries, and what Hispanics are. So for example, Latinos, it does include Brazil, it does not include Spain. And the Hispanics, it includes the Equatorial Guinea and Spain, but it does not include Brazil. And in terms of Spanish, we refer to that when someone is from Spain. Next slide, please. So now I just want to talk about the language. Hispanics and Latinos can be bilingual. For example, they can speak both Spanish and English. They can be monolingual in that they only speak Spanish. They can be monolingual in that they only speak English. Hispanics and Latinos can also speak their indigenous language. So for example, they can speak their indigenous language first, then they can speak Spanish, and then some of them may be able to speak English. What's important and to recognize that is that although there may be different dialects and variations of the language, most people do understand each other when they speak Spanish. Next slide, please. So let's define what race and ethnicity are. So race is based on a person's physical, behavioral, and cultural attributes. For example, your hair texture or your skin color. Ethnicity involves cultural expressions, language, your shared culture, and your identification. Next slide, please. So, what is culture? So, culture is made up of the values, the beliefs, the arts, the music, the foods, the standards and practices that are shared by a particular group. It includes the customs, beliefs that are created and passed down from generation as cultural traditions. It's also the religions, the morals, the experiences, values, expressions, behaviors, symbols, materials, and attitudes that are shared and given to families and children. So this is an image that I found that just basically defines culture and all the different attributes that go with it. Like I mentioned earlier, it's the food, the faith, the religion, the rituals, customs, and so on and so on. So next slide, please. This is just an image that I actually came across and I actually liked it. And in Spanish, it says, las diferencias nos enriquecen, el respeto nos une. And the translation of that is that our differences enrich us and the respect unites us. And I found that very, telling and very comforting for me because as we all know, we're in a state and the world right now that there's so many differences and biases. And I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that when we're working with families or patients especially, we need to be sensitive to some of the differences that are shared. Next slide, please. So, for example, the traditions and customs that are passed down from generation to generation. It's the Hispanic culture, I apologize. It's basically the traditions and customs that are passed down from generation to generation. It's the legends that are shared by older family members. It's the languages, the idioms, the family and social values, what we're taught, what our ancestors believe is important, the religious practices, the beliefs, the prayers, the arts and the music, the literature, the foods, and the history. Some of our Hispanic culture and Latino culture is based on Latin American roots, and the primary language is Spanish. The Spanish culture, it refers to the heritage and tradition of the people living in Spain. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the Hispanic culture, something that is really important to recognize is that the culture is family oriented. Family is first. So we can sometimes sacrifice things for the sake of our family. It's important for the children to be bien, or the translation is well-mannered or well-behaved, and not maleducado, which is impolite, fresh, or rude. Our parents, the Hispanic parents, and I am Spanish myself, I am from Puerto Rico. So I recall that my parents, and they stressed the education to me. And they also encourage us to attain a college education, and if possible, like a higher education. The Hispanic culture is also very much in the collectivism, that we do things for the family. And I'm going to define and talk about each of these individually. There's modestia, which is modesty. There's simpatía, which is caring and kindness. Respeto, which is respect. Personalismo, which is personalism. Language, personal space, and time orientation. So those are some of the attributes that are very important in the Hispanic and the Latino culture. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned earlier, the Hispanic and Latino families are very close-knit groups. The head of the family is the father. The mother is the primary caregiver. She is responsible for maintaining the home and for the children. The oldest male, or the father figure, holds the greatest power in the family. He is usually involved in making the medical decisions for the members of the family. And in the Hispanic and Latino family, the male is viewed as the provider of the family. Next slide, please. The women for years have been expected to show respect to their husbands, were viewed as being submissive to their husbands. And many women have been and continue to be victims of domestic violence, be it emotional, financial, psychological, physical, sexual, and a lot of them fail to report the abuse for many different reasons. In recent years, more women have been reporting domestic violence and are receiving the support services that they need for themselves and for their families. Some women have become Americanized and are acquiring the philosophy and the mentality. What's important to understand is that when a woman from the Hispanic or the Latina culture reports some domestic violence, she's going against the values of the family and the culture because you're taught you don't talk about it. You know, whatever happens in the home stays in the home. So sometimes when these women do report domestic violence or abuse, sometimes that creates a lot of problems for them within their family. Okay. In the Hispanic and Latino culture, there is a strong attachment to the family. And the family can be made up of the nuclear family is your parents, your children, and extended family, which can include grandparents, aunts, uncles, nieces and nephews, and cousins. And family members have a real strong sense of loyalty. Next slide, please. During difficult times, the family provides a lot of support. The family helps others deal with stress. So sometimes when a person is stressed and they're going through a difficult time, they may not seek help with like a psychotherapist, but they talk to the family members in lieu of getting medical and professional help. And it is expected to help others during the challenging and difficult time. So if your family member, for example, is not working or has lost their job, it's expected that you can help them financially, or that if they lose their apartment, they can stay with you on a temporary basis. It's also important to understand that when we travel to our countries, okay, we stay with family in their homes. Sometimes we do not stay in hotels, okay? And it's also important to recognize that families gather together to celebrate, you know, so the family, the Hispanic family is very close knit. Next slide, please. And the family also instills honor, good manners, respect for authority, and the elder. For years, preserving the Spanish language within the home was a common practice. However, that has changed a great deal because of acculturation and assimilation. When young children attend school in New York City, they do not want to maintain the language at home because they want to be able to communicate with their friends. And that's perceived as, oh, I can only speak English. And there are many times that does create a difficult and challenging time between the children and their parents, because if the children are speaking the language, but the parents are not speaking the language, then there is a miscommunication between them. Next slide. Okay. Another attribute that's very important in the Latino and Hispanic culture is what we define as personalismo or personalism. Next slide. And that's when you establish a personal connection between the patient and the doctor, or with just like a person that's seeing a therapist, or just among people themselves. And that is based on interpersonal trust and respect. So for example, no, go back. Oh, I'm sorry, go back. It is appropriate to ask your patient how they are feeling, but it's also important to ask them how their family is doing. Okay. Hispanics and Latinos enjoy physical proximity, and they perceive the closeness as appropriate. So it's okay, for example, if you offer a handshake when you're entering the office or when you're leaving the office. If the patient is crying or the person is with you and they start to cry, it is appropriate and acceptable to give them a hug. And it's also appropriate to pat them on the back when the person is leaving. Next slide, please. Something that's really important for doctors, medical staff, for students to have when working with Latinos and Hispanic families is a sense of personalismo or personalism. Latino and Hispanic families or patients, they want and they expect their doctors to be warm, personable, and to exchange pleasantries. So, for example, they may want to talk to you about things that they feel are important to them. And as doctors, you are like on a time frame. So sometimes, that can create a little bit of a difficult situation. Latinos and Hispanics will sometimes offer small gifts or advice as a form of appreciation. And they feel that it helps build up the professional relationship. At times, they do get insulted if you do not accept their small tokens of appreciation. Next slide, please. Another attribute that is very important in the Hispanic and Latino culture is the sense of collectivism. So, for example, this is an image that I came across, which is very telling. You must learn to think for yourself. That would be like the American culture. And then in the Latino and Hispanic is you must do what is best for the family. Next slide, please. I'm so sorry. Okay. So the understanding and the acceptance that the need of the family supersedes the needs of the individual. Okay. And there are times that if individual must sacrifice something for the good of the family. So for example, the oldest child may not be allowed to go to school because he or she must work to help support the family. And as the younger children go to college and attain a good job, a social status in a house and things like that, there are times that does create resentment among the siblings because, one sibling was able to attain all of these other things, whereas the oldest child may not have been able to attain that. Next slide, please. Another attribute that's really important is what we call simpatia. The actual translation of this word is sympathy. However, when we refer to simpatia, we're basically referring to pleasantness and congeniality, kindness. And it's the behaviors and actions that promote pleasant relationships among families and close friends. It also promotes politeness and helps avoid conflict among family and friends. Next slide, please. This is another image, once again, that I thought was very telling. Simpatia is the act of being polite, respectful, and not confrontational. I don't want to bother the doctor. So sometimes when you're interacting with a Hispanic or Latino patient, they may not tell you everything they need to tell you or they should be telling you because they sometimes feel that that the doctor will get mad if I tell them. So next slide, please. Respect. To the Latino and Hispanic culture, that's very, very important. And it's basically what helps define a person. So for example, a person's personal power is determined by how he or she is treated respectfully in interpersonal relations with others and how he is perceived by others. You're considered powerful if you have a good education, if you have attained a good job, and if you have a house and the social status within the community. When you're dealing with an older person, it's always very important to be attentive to their personhood, okay, and their age. So it's really important when you're dealing with an older person, you can address them as don or doña or señor or señora, which the English translation is basically Mr. and Mrs. or Ms. And I just found this image that was basically what is respect in the Latino culture. And on the next slide, I'm going to put it up. Next slide, please. It's the same thing in English, like what is respect? And it entails basically treating people the way you want to be treated. It's an attitude of caring about other people and their rights. is following the rules of your family, in your country, in your school. It also pertains to treating the poverty and environment with care, speaking courteously to everyone, even if there is a conflict, listening to another person's opinion, even if you don't agree, and then stating your opinion to honor your rights to modesty, privacy, and safety. So in the Latino culture, respeto or respect is very, very important to us. Next slide, please. Modestia. And that's also similar to respeto, but in modestia, which is modesty, a family member would generally accompany a patient to a medical appointment if the doctor is of an opposite sex. So, and that can be challenging to the doctor. So for example, if a man is married and his wife has a doctor's appointment with a male doctor, he may ask one of his sisters or one of his sisters-in-law to accompany the patient to the doctor's office. And yet, at the doctor's office, that can sometimes create problems because the patient may not want the chaperone to go into the room, so they can talk to the doctor privately. And then sometimes they feel compelled that they have to allow the chaperone to go into the room with them. And sometimes the patient will not be forthcoming with everything she may want to talk to the doctor about. Next slide, please. Another brainstorm that I came up with is, how would you define the roles of the Hispanic man and woman? And I'll give you a minute if you want to just put anything in the chat.
I'm sorry, can you clarify that question in terms of roles? You're talking about social roles?
In terms of the family, like, you know, the role of the father, the mother, because it leads into something else that's really important in the Latino culture. It pertains to like the machismo and the marianismo. The spouse is to show this, very good. Patriarch, okay. Persons speak or ancestors speak, okay. So these are good answers. So I'm going to move on, and then next slide, please. No, the opposite, the other way. Okay. So for example, in the Hispanic and Latino culture, and the hierarchy is that the father is in charge of the family. Okay. Then it's, no, go back. Okay. Then it's the mother, then it's the children, and then it's the extended family. Okay. You're right, Tanya. Victoria, please go back 1 minute. You're right, Tanya. Your comment that the mother is the nurturer and she's in charge of taking care of the kids and maintaining the home. That's absolutely true. And then it's also the extended family. Okay, so just go to the next slide, please. This is something that it's a real sensitive discussion in the Hispanic and Latino culture, and sometimes we don't talk about it, but we do know that it does exist. So the traditional role of the man and the woman is that the father is the head of the household, and that can be perceived as machismo. The woman is marianismo. She's spiritually superior. She's the homemaker and the caretaker of the children. Next slide, please. The next couple of slides, they basically talk about these two topics that are really important in the culture, because machismo is a Latin term used in many cultures to indicate maleness, virility, and the man's role as a provider and a protector. Marianismo is derived from the cult of the Virgin Mary, and that women are seen as morally and spiritually superior and are capable of enduring greater suffering. And sometimes with the terms of machismo, like if a man is married and he has a girlfriend, for many years, and in some cultures, in the Hispanic and Latino cultures, it's okay that your husband is like unfaithful to you as long as he's providing for you. Although this has been changing over the years. Next slide, please. Once again, I'm just comparing here what machismo is and what marianismo is in terms of hypervirility, and the other one is hyperfemininity. And then it's the physical strength versus inner strength, virility versus chastity, incredible sexual prowess versus loyalty, high energy versus passivity, control, subservient, docility, emotional detachment, and selflessness. So the man, he does love his wife and love his family and loves his children. However, there is definitely like an emotional detachment, whereas the woman will give anything and everything of herself to keep her family together, and she will do anything for the family. And then there's the rejection of the difference of, like, excuse me, homosexuality, and then the acceptance of her faith. Next slide. So I just came across this and I actually thought that it said a lot. Machismo makes no provision for preparing lunch, doing the laundry, and minding the baby. A lot of Hispanic and Latino men, especially the older ones, actually thought that this was all a woman was for, to have children, to maintain the household, and to cook and clean while they were out there working and they can do whatever they wanted. Next slide, please. Actually, I came across this slide, um, and this is Alexandra Ocasio, and she says, "For those who ask how I learned to handle pressure, try being the only daughter in a Latino household." And I just, to me, that's very compelling because as a Latina woman myself, there is a lot of pressure when you're in a Latino and Hispanic household. Like, I can tell you this from my own personal experience. When I decided to go to college, my father's family wasn't supportive of the idea. My grandmother actually thought that my sister and I should just, graduate from high school, get a regular job like in an office or like in a factory or something like that, and just have children. And I remember when my sister and I were both going to college, my grandmother couldn't understand it, and my father's family was not supportive. Yet my father and mother, who were both college educated, were very supportive of the fact that my sister and I decided to go to college. So next slide. Once again, this is another image that I just found that is very telling to me. Is the tragedy of machismo is that a man is never quite man enough. And that's actually true because it's almost like the man is perceived that he can do no wrong as long as he provides for his family, as long as he's, paying for their bills and their rent and their food and things like that. Next slide, please. This is actually something that I came across in terms of Marianismo, and it's an image that is very telling of the Latino family. For example, when your Mexican parents feel bad for white kids being kicked out at 18, but then you realize you're a pregnant teen and that kind of empathy doesn't apply to you. And that happens quite a lot in the Latino culture and the Hispanic culture. You're supposed to remain a virgin until you get married. You're not supposed to have children out of wedlock. And sometimes when you are young and you get pregnant, sometimes your parents are not very supportive of the situation. And there are times that then the mother wants to assume the role of the mother for the grandchild. And that creates a lot of tension and conflict between the mother, the daughter, and then the newborn. So that was another thing that I stood out to when I was doing some research on this. Next slide. And this is like just a slide that is very telling to me as a Latina woman that says she has this irritating habit of looking over her shoulder when I'm weighing up a pretty girl behind her. Because sometimes, if you're with your husband and he looks at another woman, you're not supposed to say anything to him. You're supposed to just be submissive and just ignore the situation. So next slide, please. Here we're talking about personal space. Personal space refers to the amount of physical space that is considered culturally appropriate between people. Hispanics have found to prefer a smaller personal space. That is, they feel comfortable when physically close to others. And that's actually very true. Like we have our small circle of friends, and once we're with our friends, we're able to just be who we are. Like we don't have any, like let's say restrictions on how we behave among our friends. Next slide, please. In terms of the time orientation, there is a difference between the, for example, there's a difference between future and present oriented cultures. Hispanics tend to be more present oriented, and it's the quality of the interpersonal interaction that is more important to us rather than the length of time that we're together. And also among Latinos and Hispanics, there's a joke. So we call it Latino time or Puerto Rican time or Dominican time or whatever it is, based on where you come from. Meaning that if you invite me to your home, let's say you say dinner's going to be served at 6 o'clock. And if I show up at 8 o'clock, it's acceptable. And if I show up with, one or two other people that were initially not invited, it's okay. However, most of us that have been, acclimated to the American culture, we know that when it's 6 o'clock, it is 6 o'clock. So there is an inside joke among Latinos and Hispanic, like when you invite someone, you tell them, remember, we are working on American time. We're not working on Spanish time or Latino time. So next slide, please. In terms of etiquette, a lot of Hispanic and Latinos prefer to be formal when they're interacting with others, especially if it's someone that they're not very close to. So it's acceptable to offer a handshake when you're greeting others and when you're leaving. Okay. A kiss on the cheek is a common practice that you may see and you may when you're greeting friends and family, and that's very common among Latinos and Hispanics. And in the Spanish language, we have the formal and informal use of the word you. So it's usted or tú, which is polite and familiar commands. And it's, for example, if I'm out with some of my friends and I'm going to call one of them, I may say tú because it's a close relationship. But if I'm talking to someone that's older than me, okay, I will then use the word usted. And it's just a form of being polite and respectful. It's also important to remember when you're dealing with a person, you can refer to them as doña, like I said earlier, or señor or señora. Okay, if you want to call them by their first name, it's always very important to ask for permission to do that. When in a group among Latinos and Hispanics, the conversations can get very loud. Okay, they tend to speak really fast. Sometimes they use hand gestures, like, to sort of help convey the message, or they will use the body language to help convey the same message. Okay, next slide, please. They place importance on looks and appearances. They provide a sense of dignity, pride, and honor. So we should always look good. That's what some of our family members, the older ones, tell us. It's also very important to remember that they will wear formal attire when going to parties, church, or social gatherings, and even to work. Sometimes, they go to work a little overdressed, okay? Hispanics and Latinos are relaxed and flexible about time and punctuality. For example, Latino time. So it is acceptable to be late and to bring an extra guest if you're invited to a party or a social gathering. However, there are times that they are afraid or they refuse to speak publicly because of the accent that they have. They feel embarrassed when others may not understand them clearly. And that's why sometimes why they shy away from doing public speaking. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Hispanic rituals and the religion. Okay, next slide, please. For example, the religious beliefs and practices, okay? Church is very important in the Hispanic and Latino cultures, okay? God is an active force in life. The church and the faith are central to prayer. There's daily prayer. The symbolisms is the cross, the images of the saints, the rosary, the images of the Virgin Mary, and the family members mourn in black, okay? And then in terms of the practices surrounding the major life events, it's weddings. Like when they're getting married, they have to attend the marriage prep classes, especially if it's in the Catholic Church. They go to mass and they go as a family unit. Then there's like Bible studies, okay? And then there's like the fruitcake soak and rum. And that's very common when you go sometimes to the church gatherings. And then the grief, which is the luto. And in the Hispanic family, when a person passes away after we bury them, we mourn them for like 9 days. And then we have a vigil in the person's home, and we have food, we have prayer. And then at the very last night, which is the ninth night, we have like a celebration. There's also baptism before death, and the rosary is throughout the day. And then we have the wakes. Next slide, please. Like I mentioned earlier, it's important to recognize that the religion plays a very important role in the Hispanic and Latino culture. Okay, most of the Hispanics and Latino are Catholic. However, other religions have gained growth in the Hispanic community. Jehovah Witness, Pentecostal, Reborn Christian, even Seventh-day Adventists. And when there are sometimes that people convert to other religions, it's also important to recognize that the church, okay, and the faith are central to the families and the communities. The church and the religion provides hope, strength, especially in times of need, when a person is sick or when there's trouble in the home. Okay. Next slide, please. The role of the church is to help influence the family live a good life. Communities celebrate its patron saint days with special ceremonies. As a Puerto Rican woman, I recall that in New York City, there was a big holiday called El Dia de San Juan, and the celebration was usually held in Randall's Island in Manhattan. And I remember going there as a child with my family, and everyone there was mostly Puerto Rican, and they were just celebrating this saint's day. So it's important to understand that each country does have their special patrons. They also have special celebrations, okay? Hispanics and Latinos practice Catholicism, which has traces to the Indian and the African American religions. So some of the religions include brujeria, which is witchcraft, santeria, espiritismo, which is spiritualism, curanderos, which are medicine men or healers, lleveras, which are herbalists, hueseros, which are bone setters, parteras, which are midwives, and sobadoras, masseuse. Okay, next slide. And sometimes when you go to a person's home, you may see like pictures of saints. Sometimes a person can have an altar in their home with candles and rosaries. And like, depending on your religion, like in the Santeria, they may bring food, to honor the God. Okay, each saint represents a specific purpose. Infants are generally baptized when they are a few months old. We actually try to baptize children before they are 6 month, because we feel that if something happens to the child, it's an angel and they need to go to heaven. Okay, there's also the anointing of the sick, like when the patient is in the hospital with a life-threatening medical situation. And in the Latino culture and Hispanic culture, there's something called la voluntad de Dios, fatalism. It's like my illness or an illness is viewed as God's will, or that I'm being punished for of sinful behavior. And I sort of have to accept whatever God's destiny for me is. Next slide, please. Hispanic celebrations. It's just I just saw this image and I found it really interesting because it has a little bit of many different cultures there. So next slides, please. Like I said earlier, most Hispanic countries celebrate what we call Easter, Christmas Eve, Christmas, New Year's Day, and Three Kings Day. January 6th is actually a very big holiday in other Hispanic and Latino countries. For many years, it was more important to us than the Christmas Day itself. Each country has its own Dia de Independencia, each Independence Day. There are also official national holidays, like you can have local, regional, and national festivals that can occur on a specific day or last a few days. For example, I know in Puerto Rico, each town may have like a celebration where there could be music. The business offices actually close early. The banks can close, or people were working there, but they're working half a day. And most of the holidays are centered on religion. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of food, this is something like what Spanish, Puerto Rican, because those are tostones. I would say that's rice, and that's like avocado salad with like beef, ropa vieja or something like that. So there's so much food, among the Latinos, and, we have Mexican food, Dominican food, and, Puerto Rican food, and so on and so on. And a lot of the time we use the same ingredients, it's just that we can cook it differently. Next slide, please. So the eating habits. It's very important to understand that Hispanics and Latinos generally have a light meal for breakfast in their countries. El almuerzo, meaning lunch, it's usually the main course of the day. And at times, the family members and the children gather to have the meal, the almuerzo at lunch, because it's the most important meal of the day. And then there's also the siesta, which is the period where people rest after lunch. And then they have what they call a merienda, which is like a light snack that's it could be a coffee, a roll, or sandwich, and that's usually just for children when they come home from school. La cena, which is dinner, is usually a small meal, and it can be as late as 9 o'clock in the evening. But usually in the Hispanic and Latino countries, okay, the almuerzo is the most important meal of the day because it gives people an opportunity to get together. Next slide, please. Once the Hispanics and the Latinos settle in the United States and acculturate and assimilate, then they do adapt the 3 meal system, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, like in New York, let's say, for example, or in the States. And then they understand that breakfast is like most important instead of the lunch, even though we do recognize that we should have a light dinner. The midday and evening meals are important family and social events. It allows family members to gather together to talk about their day, to talk about major life events that are going on, politics and things like that. What's important to recognize is that if you have a guest over and after dinner, you may then get together for like an after dinner drink, which is gives you and also and a time to sort of linger and continue talking about the things. Like I know as a child growing up and I would visit my father's family after dinner, like the adults would have ani and then they will have coffee with that. And sometimes when you invite a Hispanic or Latino person to your house and you offer them food, they may not initially take it. So you sort of ask them the second and the third time, and then by then they're willing to take it. And the reason is because they do not want you to think that they just came to your home so they can have dinner with you. Like you sort of have to coach them and encourage them. No, come, let's just eat, let's have dinner with us and things like that. Next slide, please. And I just found this slide very telling. And it says, we're a very tolerant society, but if you don't behave like us, you can go back to where your bloody came from. And it's very telling for me as a social worker, especially because there are many families, Hispanic and Latinos, that struggle with acculturation and struggle with let's say, acculturating and assimilating into the country. Okay, so someone just put a message. In terms of table manners, let me see what E.T. mentioned. Give me 1 second, please. Yes, actually, E.T., you're absolutely right. You do have to wait until the eldest person or the head of the household is seated before you can actually eat. So that's also very important. Thank you for pointing that out. Next slide. Hispanics in education, okay? There's a misconception that Hispanics and Latinos do not value education. Parents and caregivers actually stress the importance of attending college or achieving higher education. Teachers are held in high regards, the same as doctors, okay? So whenever you interact with them, it's really important to show them respect. Teachers are responsible for teaching skills that help achieve success, a good career, and social mobility. It is important, it is difficult to question a teacher's authority since we consider them to be experts. It's the same with doctors. Sometimes they will not question you because they hold you in self and high esteem. Next slide, please. There are many times that the Hispanics and Latinos are reluctant to give suggestions or even question the educational process because they hold teachers in so high regard that they say, well, what am I talking about? I don't know what I'm going to ask the teacher. So I'm just trusting that whatever the teacher is telling me is accurate. There are times that, sometimes teachers, and I worked as a school social worker, and a lot of teachers would complain that the Hispanic and Latino parents wouldn't come to attend like parent-teacher conference, or they wouldn't come to like the social events at the school for their children. But they have to, and I would tell them, try to understand that a lot of them cannot come because they have 2 jobs and they cannot get time off from work. So it's important to recognize that whatever document you're sending to either a patient, or if you are in the school system, it should be done in Spanish. So whenever you're sending a note to a patient, try to make sure that it is in both languages, English and Spanish, because there are times that they may not do it. Okay, so next slide. These are barriers. I thank you, Shirley. These are some of the barriers to the health care among Latinos. Next slide, please. I'm just going to run through them because I know we have another presenter. It's the inability to speak English, lack of trained interpreters, lack of medical insurance. Sometimes they have different cultural beliefs, illegal immigration status. Okay, so next slide, please. Mental health among Latinos is not accepted. So as Latinos, our cultures wire us to not acknowledge mental health issues as such, rather looking at them as weakness and with shame. Swipe them under a rug, because if you let it be, things will get better, and we all know that they don't. Next slide, please. So I was just talking here about the different beliefs that sometimes when a person comes to seek conventional help from a medical doctor, they've already looked at other places. So like with other kind of health, traditional folk remedies. Next slide, please. Next slide, I'll just skip through them. It's important to just ask the Hispanic and Latino patient in a sensitive way if they're using any kind of alternative therapy. It's also important to include the family as a vital resource in health planning. Instructions should be done in Spanish. Review the instructions, because sometimes you may have patients that are illiterate, and sometimes some patients believe in the el destino de Dios, like I talked about earlier. And when you're dealing with the older patients, it's important that they may be uncomfortable. So it's really important never to use a family member to translate. Next slide, please. It's always very important. This is something that is really important, and I'll go through it quickly. You have what they call the post-traumatic shock or anxiety. The Hispanic and Latinos may call that a susto. So if a person, which is a trauma that they witness or that they themselves experience, but they may not think that they need therapy or help for that. So sometimes when a person is sick, they call that an empacho. They may not seek medical treatment because they just think it's something that will pass. And then sometimes it's something that is, if a child fails to thrive, it's because someone did a mal de ojo, or like they put a hex on the child. Next slide, please. These are some of the health beliefs. Like, it's important to know when the person came to seek help, who is the patient that is seeking help, how the self-care will be managed by the patient or the family, which health choices are made and by whom, how a person is going to respond to the treatment or the therapy that's recommended. It's important to recognize that the patient, if he has trust and he feels that there's an interpersonal connection with the provider, he will usually be complying with the treatment. It's also important to recognize how social, cultural, and psychological factors affect physical health. Next slide, please. Just important to, when you're working with older adults, demonstrate some kindness, be friendly and approachable, show respect. Next slide, please. If you do not speak Spanish, like I said earlier, please use a translator. You never want to use a family member for translation because of the fact that the patient may not want to share and the family member may not want to know. It's important to stress the importance of establishing trust, showing respect, and demonstrating an interest in your patient. And sometimes the Hispanic and Latino patients may not have many questions for you as doctors. Next slide. Okay, next slide. I can just skip that. Music and art is very important. Next slide. These are some of the I just put images of them, of what's important, because the music and the art is sometimes indicative of like the political statements that the musician or the artist are trying to make. Next slide, please. Next slide. These are just images, some of the instruments that are used. Okay. And on that note, that concludes my presentation. And this is just a slide that I came across. It says, "Somos de aquí," we're from here. And it's just, I liked it because it encompasses all the different cultures and among Hispanics and Latinos. And thank you for the opportunity for presenting. Any questions? Because I know we have another presentation.